Isaiah's prophecy is being fulfilled in 2026. Is the rapture near? 2,600 years ago, a man walked the streets of Jerusalem with his body exposed and his feet on the ground. It was not madness. It was a message. Every step of that prophet was a countdown that most preferred to ignore. Today, in 2026, while missiles cross the skies of the Middle East and nations that Isaiah named by name wage wars in real time, a silent question grows within those who read those ancient words. What if the prophetic clock is in its final seconds? If this content is touching you in some way, I want to extend a very special invitation to you. We have prepared an ebook with 60 prayers for daily life. They are practical, direct, and powerful prayers designed to strengthen your faith, open paths, and bring protection, health, and prosperity to your routine. It is at a promotional price, and the link is in the pinned comment below. In addition to helping you spiritually every day, when you purchase the ebook, you also help keep this channel active, allowing us to continue bringing daily videos like this to you. So take a look at the pinned comment, access the link, and guarantee yours while it is at the special price. And of course, if this type of content makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel now. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming messages. Let us continue. To understand what is happening now, you first need to understand who this man was. Not just the prophet, the human being behind the words, the individual who woke up in the morning, looked at the world around him, and felt the unbearable weight of knowing things that no one wanted to hear. Around the year 770 before Christ, the kingdom of Judah breathed under a tension it could not name. Jerusalem still stood, the temple still functioned, the market still opened in the morning. But there was something rotten beneath the surface, an instability spreading like cracks in a wall before it collapses. The world around was changing too fast. Great empires advanced through the Near East, like a tide that does not respect borders drawn by men. Political alliances were made and unmade in weeks, and within Jerusalem itself, while the rich built increasingly larger houses, the poor lost the little they had. It is in this scenario that Isaiah emerges. He did not come from the common people. Everything indicates that Isaiah was part of the elite of Jerusalem, someone with access to the temple, the court, and the decisions that truly mattered. The very name of his father, Amoz, and the references scattered throughout the text suggest that he moved among the centers of power with naturalness. This was no minor detail. This explains why his words were not whispered in the shadows of alleys, but echoed in the spaces where kings consulted advisors and priests negotiated influence. During approximately 50 years of active ministry, his speeches accompanied the main events of Judah, spanning at least 4 different reigns and moments of crisis that would make any ordinary person recoil in silence. But Isaiah did not recoil. The texts that bear his name show someone deeply attentive to his time. He observed the growth of corruption with clinical eyes. He denounced the concentration of wealth with a frankness that discomforted the powerful. He warned of the risks of trusting in political treaties instead of seeking the internal stability of the kingdom. What he wrote had everything to do with his own historical moment. But the question that persists, the question that you, who are reading this, probably also ask yourself, is this: where did his inspiration come from? Did Isaiah see the future in a supernatural way? Or was he merely an extraordinarily perceptive observer, capable of reading the patterns of history with a precision that would seem prophetic to the eyes of later generations? This tension has no easy answer, and it is precisely why it remains relevant 2,600 years later. Isaiah himself answers this question in the 6th chapter of his book. And the answer does not come in the form of a theological argument or a philosophical treatise. It comes in the form of a narrative, a scene, an encounter that marked him in such a way that he felt the need to record it with details that still cause impact when read today. The narrative is situated in the year of King Uzziah's death, around 740 before Christ. This detail is not decorative. It is a deliberate historical anchoring. Uzziah had reigned for 52 years, more than 5 decades of a government that, despite its flaws, brought a certain stability to Judah. With his death, a cycle was ending. A real political transition was underway, and it is precisely in this moment of collective uncertainty that Isaiah describes having a vision inside the Temple of Jerusalem. He reports seeing the Lord on a throne. The description is laden with symbolism, the divine presence symbolically occupying the entire sacred space, while celestial beings, the seraphim, proclaimed divine holiness with an intensity that made the structures of the temple shake. 6 wings each, 2 to cover the face, 2 to cover the feet, 2 to fly, and the proclamation that did not stop. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Before this scene, Isaiah does not react with serene devotion. He reacts with terror. Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. This reaction follows a pattern that appears repeatedly in the accounts of prophetic vocation in the Hebrew Scriptures. The future prophet presents himself as unworthy, inadequate, unable to fulfill the mission. Moses said he did not know how to speak. Jeremiah said he was too young. Isaiah said he was unclean. The pattern is consistent. The call does not begin with confidence. It begins with the collapse of all self-sufficiency. Then the central gesture of the scene occurs. One of the seraphim approaches, in his hand a live coal taken from the altar with tongs. He touches Isaiah's lips with it and declares, "Thy guilt is taken away and thy sin purged." In the symbolic logic of the text, this gesture represents the purification of speech, not just of the person, but specifically of the instrument that would be used to transmit the messages. The lips that had declared themselves unclean were now prepared to speak in the name of the God Isaiah had just seen. Next comes the voice, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And Isaiah, now purified, responds with 3 words that carry the weight of a lifetime. "Here am I, send me." From that moment on, Isaiah officially became a prophet. But what comes immediately after is disconcerting. The mission entrusted to him is not one of triumph and acclaim. It is one of structural conflict. He will be sent to announce messages that would be rejected. He will speak to ears that will not hear. He will see for eyes that will choose not to see. And this will last until the judgment he announces becomes historical reality. It was not a popular prophecy. It was a true prophecy. For you to understand what Isaiah faced in the following years, you need to measure the size of the empire advancing on the horizon. Assyria was not simply a powerful nation. It was a machine of systematized destruction that operated with an efficiency that still causes shivers in historians today. The Assyrian army had about 100,000 soldiers organized into specialized divisions: infantry, cavalry, siege units, military engineers who built earthen ramps to scale walls in a matter of weeks. When Assyria besieged a city, the question was never if it would fall. The question was how long it would take. Think about what this meant for a small kingdom like Judah. Jerusalem had, in that period, an estimated population between 25,000 and 30,000 inhabitants. It was a medium-sized city by the standards of the time, with solid but not invincible walls, dependent on external alliances to survive in case of an attack by a superpower. And around it, the political map was simplifying brutally. Large empires absorbing small kingdoms, independence giving way to tribute, tribute giving way to deportation. It was in this context that the advisors of Judah began to whisper in the corridors of power, "Egypt will come to our aid. The kingdom of Cush will rise with us. An alliance will solve everything." Isaiah heard these whispers, and he responded with the silence of his own body. Chapter 20 of his book records one of the most radical gestures in biblical prophetic history. God instructed Isaiah to remove his sackcloth and his sandals, and Isaiah obeyed. For 3 years, he walked the streets of Jerusalem practically naked and barefoot. 3 years, not 3 hours to draw attention, not 3 days as a symbolic fast, 3 full years, approximately 1,095 days of constant physical exposure, of looks of estrangement, of increasing social isolation. 3 years, too long to be theater, too long to be eccentricity, enough time for every person in Jerusalem to have seen that man at least dozens of times and understood that there was something different happening. In that culture, Isaiah's appearance did not communicate poverty. It communicated defeat. This was how prisoners of war were led after the fall of a city, barefoot, semi-naked, dragged away from their land as human trophies of the victor. When the people of Jerusalem saw Isaiah walking in those conditions, the brain made the association automatically, and the message arrived before he opened his mouth. Egypt will fail. Ethiopia will fail. Any alliance you build with these nations will end exactly like this, with your allies being dragged naked and barefoot before the Assyrians. But no one wanted to hear that, and therefore no one wanted to be near the one announcing it. Isaiah became a lonely man, not for lack of people around, but because no one wanted to be seen beside someone who announced the failure of all the city's political plans. He walked, people looked away, or diverted their entire path. Entire months like this. And when Egypt truly failed, when Assyria confirmed the worst scenario Isaiah had described, the memory returned like a late shiver that no one could shake. The man who had walked barefoot had already warned them, with his own body, for 3 years straight. But Isaiah was not just a political critic with unconventional methods. He was an observer of history, with access to a perspective that surpassed the present moment. And it was this perspective that produced some of the most notable statements in the book that bears his name. The kingdom of Israel, to the north of Judah, lived in accelerated collapse. Kings succeeded each other through conspiracies, 6 different monarchs in less than 30 years, several of them assassinated by their own successors. Alliances were made and unmade in months. The central government lost control over the territory as Assyrian pressure increased. Israel tried to survive by paying heavy tributes to Assyria. Then it tried to break this submission by betting on agreements with Egypt. Then it allied with Syria to face Assyria together. And when it tried to force Judah to participate in this coalition and Judah refused, Israel and Syria went as far as attacking Jerusalem. The Assyrian reaction was devastating and swift. Damascus was destroyed. The Syrian army dismantled. Israel lost a large part of its territory. Weakened and unable to sustain new rebellions, the kingdom was at the mercy of the movements of Sargon II, one of the greatest conquerors of the Assyrian period. Around 725 before Christ, Samaria, the capital of Israel, was besieged. The siege lasted approximately 3 years. 3 years of progressive hunger within the walls, of diseases spreading in closed spaces, of hope slowly dying while the Assyrians waited outside with military patience. In 722 before Christ, the city fell. The fall. A significant part of the population was deported. It is estimated that between 27,000 and 30,000 people were removed from Samaria and relocated to other regions of the Assyrian Empire. A deliberate policy of cultural dismemberment that prevented the reconstruction of collective identity and organized resistance. In their place, peoples from other regions were brought to the territory of Israel, mixing cultures and diluting the ethnic cohesion that could fuel future rebellions. The Kingdom of Israel ceased to exist as an independent state, forever. Isaiah interpreted this collapse not as a geopolitical accident, but as the result of a long and predictable process. A kingdom that fragmented internally, that trusted in unstable alliances instead of strengthening its own foundations, that traded internal coherence for dependence on external powers that, at the decisive moment, did not appear to save anyone. The fall of Samaria was not just the end of a kingdom. It was a clear warning left in history so that Judah and any nation that came after would understand the cost of political self-deception. And it was from this background, wars, deportations, collapses of kingdoms, advancing empires, that Isaiah began to write the words that 2,600 years later continue to cause debate. Words that do not speak only about Assyria or Babylon. Words that name locations, describe situations, and announce consequences with a specificity that defies simple explanation. Can you imagine writing about events that will happen 26 centuries after your time? Chapter 17 of the book of Isaiah begins with a direct statement. Behold, the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. In the original context, this prophecy referred to the destruction of Syrian Damascus by the Assyrians, which indeed occurred. But what draws the attention of contemporary scholars and observers is that the text seems to describe a more total destruction than what happened historically. Damascus survived the Assyrian conquest and continued to be inhabited for centuries. It exists to this day, being considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, with more than 4,000 years of documented existence. So was the prophecy only partially fulfilled, or is there still a pending fulfillment? This is the tension that makes chapter 17 of the book of Isaiah be cited repeatedly in contemporary prophetic study circles, especially in recent years, with the Syrian civil war that began in 2011 and turned much of the country into rubble. With an estimated 500,000 dead by the end of 2024, more than 6 million internally displaced, and another 6 million refugees scattered across the world. In December 2024, the Assad regime fell after 53 years in power. Images of Damascus in the post-fall period showed a city still standing, but a deeply fragmented nation, with entire parts of the territory controlled by distinct groups and Israeli airstrikes hitting military infrastructure regularly. Damascus still exists. But what happened around it has a weight difficult to ignore for those who read Isaiah 17. Chapter 10 of the same book adds another layer. Isaiah describes divine judgment on regions that became allies of enemy powers, and specifically mentions areas that correspond to what we know today as Lebanon. The Lebanon of 2026 lives through a crisis accumulating decades, an economy that collapsed in the early 2020s, a currency that lost more than 90% of its value, an infrastructure devastated by years of conflict and by the explosion of the port of Beirut in August 2020, which killed more than 200 people and injured more than 6,000 Druze, destroying a radius of several kilometers of the capital. Above all this, Hezbollah, considered the most powerful non-state armed force in the world, with an arsenal estimated at more than 150,000 projectiles, was hit hard by Israeli operations in the second half of 2024, which eliminated its leadership core, including Hassan Nasrallah, its Secretary General for 32 consecutive years. Lebanon trembled, and those who know Isaiah 10 remembered the words about divine judgment on the allies of Israel's enemies. But it is chapter 14 that perhaps carries the densest and most debated images. Isaiah describes there the fall of a king of Babylon with language that transcends the political and enters the cosmic, including a figure called by the Hebrew name Helel ben Shachar, which Christian traditions identified with Lucifer, the fallen angel. But in the same chapter, Isaiah also prophesies about the restoration of Israel and the judgment on Philistia, the territory that today corresponds approximately to the Gaza Strip, Gaza, the name that appeared in headlines every day for more than a consecutive year, starting in October 2023, a conflict that, by the end of 2025, had claimed more than 70,000 lives, according to widely publicized estimates, with more than 100,000 documented wounded, and a significant portion of the territory's infrastructure reduced to rubble. The ceasefire agreement negotiated in early 2025 was described by analysts as structurally fragile, a pause in permanent tension, not a resolution, and Isaiah had spoken about judgment on Philistia. Can you measure the weight of this overlap? We are not talking about vague coincidences between ancient texts and modern events. We are talking about specific geographical names: Damascus, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, appearing in a text written approximately 2,700 years ago, corresponding to regions that in 2026 are at the epicenter of active conflicts, documented in real time by satellites, cameras, and journalists from all over the world. This proves nothing conclusively, but it is impossible to read Isaiah and look at the map of the Middle East today without feeling something that is difficult to name with precision. Scholars who work with prophetic hermeneutics, the discipline that analyzes how prophetic texts should be interpreted, warn of the risks of what they call newspaper reading of the Bible, the tendency to take contemporary events and force them into ancient texts, ignoring the original historical context and creating interpretations that satisfy the anxiety of the present, but do not respect the integrity of the text. This risk is real, and any honest analysis of Isaiah's prophecies needs to recognize it. But there is another equally valid perspective. When a text describes with sufficient specificity certain patterns of events, the instability of a specific region, the tension between a specific people and their neighbors, the collapse of political alliances, the emergence of powers from the north, and these patterns repeat consistently in the same region for centuries, it deserves careful attention. Not necessarily as proof of the supernatural, but as evidence that the text captures something real about the dynamics of that region that transcends the moment it was written. There is an element in the book of Isaiah that rarely appears in popular discussions about prophecies, but which is perhaps the most impressive of all. In chapter 44, verses 26 to 28, and in chapter 45, verses 1 and following, Isaiah names a king called Cyrus, Cyrus the Great of Persia, and announces that this king would order the reconstruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The problem for skeptics is simple. Cyrus was born approximately 150 years after Isaiah. Isaiah called by name a king who had not yet been born, of an empire that did not yet exist in the form it would assume, and described with precision the decree that this king would issue. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 before Christ and issued his famous decree allowing the deported Jews to return to their land and rebuild the temple, a decree confirmed not only by the Hebrew scriptures, but also by the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, a real archaeological document displayed today in the British Museum in London. Isaiah's prediction had been fulfilled with a precision that still divides scholars today. Those who reject the unified authorship of the book argue that this section was written by a second author after the events. Those who defend the integrity of the text argue that this is exactly what supernatural prophecy means. Neither side can be easily dismissed, but the existence of the Cyrus Cylinder in a museum in London, containing in cuneiform the voice of a Persian king who authorized the return of the Jews to their land, is an archaeological fact. It is possible to see it, photograph it, read it, and compare it with what Isaiah wrote. It worked. Now we come to the point that many are waiting for. The point that the title of this narrative raises in plain letters. Is the rapture near? Before any answer, it is necessary to be honest about what this question involves. The concept of the rapture, the event described by Paul in the first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 4, verses 16 and 17, in which believers would be transformed and meet Christ in the air, does not appear explicitly in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah belongs to the period of the First Testament and speaks within a theological structure that looks toward the restoration of Israel, the judgment of the nations, and the coming of a suffering servant whom many Christians identify with Jesus of Nazareth. The Christian concept of the rapture is later and belongs to the theology of the New Testament. What Isaiah offers is not a calendar of the end times. It is a pattern of judgment, restoration, collapse of empires, perseverance of a specific people, and progressive fulfillment of divine purposes that operate within history but surpass it. And it is in this pattern that the connection with the present becomes more significant than any attempt to create a prophetic timeline. Think of the picture Isaiah paints. Israel in the center, surrounded by nations that alternate between alliance and hostility. Powers from the north pulling strings behind the scenes. Disputes over Jerusalem as a geopolitical point of gravity. Unstable alliances that promise security and deliver humiliation. Moments of collapse followed by unexpected restoration. This pattern is not abstract. It is the map of the Middle East in 2026. Iran, ancient Persia, the same territory whose King Cyrus was named by Isaiah, finances and coordinates a network of militias that encircle Israel on multiple flanks. Hezbollah to the north through Lebanon, Hamas to the west through Gaza, the Houthis to the south through Yemen attacking strategic maritime routes, Iraqi militias to the east. This architecture of encirclement is unprecedented in recent history and represents exactly the type of coalition that the prophets described repeatedly. Russia, an ally of Syria since 2015 with a direct military presence in the country, supplying weapons to the regime and to Iran, positions itself as a northern power with the capacity to influence the region's conflicts in a way that Western analysts are still trying to map completely. The United States, on the other hand, maintains aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, provides military and diplomatic support to Israel, and operates within a political tradition, especially strong among American evangelicals, that reads biblical prophecies as a geopolitical script with practical consequences in Washington's decisions. North against South, East against West. Israel in the center. If you open Ezekiel 38 and 39 now, you will find a description of a great coalition of northern nations attacking Israel at a time when the people were gathered back to their land. Scholars have debated for decades which modern nations correspond to the biblical names mentioned there. But the geographical structure of the alliance, northern powers moving against Israel, is difficult to ignore when looking at the role of Russia and Iran in the current scenario. But here is where intellectual integrity requires a pause. Over the last 2 centuries, there have been at least a dozen historical moments in which serious observers and sincere devotees announced that they were living in the end times, that the prophecies were finally being fulfilled, that the return of Christ was imminent. The First World War brought this feeling. The Second World War intensified it. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was interpreted by many as the definitive fulfillment of Isaiah and Ezekiel. The Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel recaptured Jerusalem, seemed to many the final trigger. The attack of 2023 and the subsequent war in Gaza produced a new wave of declarations about prophetic fulfillment in progress. In all these moments, intelligent, sincere, and well-intentioned people said, "Now is the time," and history continued. This does not invalidate the prophecies, but it places a necessary marker of humility on any interpretation that declares with certainty to be mapping the divine calendar. What we can say with honesty is different from the certainty that some want to find and others want to sell. We can say that the scenario described by Isaiah, Israel at the center of regional pressures, northern and eastern powers maneuvering, Jerusalem as a point of spiritual and geopolitical gravity, corresponds with remarkable consistency to what we see today. We can say that some of the nations named by Isaiah are in active conflict at the moment you read these words. We can say that the restoration of Israel as a nation, something that for 2,000 years seemed impossible, happened in 1948 and was followed by wars that confirmed the pattern of hostility that Isaiah described. We can say that this is extraordinary. What we cannot say it without incurring an error that Jesus himself warned against in Matthew 24, verse 36, is that we know the day and the hour. There is something, however, that is often lost in discussions about prophecies, something that Isaiah not only wrote but lived so radically that it changed his body forever. The spiritual dimension is not secondary to the geopolitical. It is the reason why the geopolitical matters. Isaiah did not spend 3 years walking naked through the streets of Jerusalem because he cared about strategic analysis or the balance of power in the Near East. He did it because he believed with every cell of his body that there is a God who acts within history and that human choices, individual and collective, have real consequences that unfold in time. Idolatry was not for him an abstract religious problem. It was the substitution of reality for an illusion, and illusions eventually collect a price. When Isaiah denounced the corruption of Judah's leaders, it was not just political criticism. It was the observation that a people who abandon internal justice cannot sustain external stability. When he warned against alliances with Egypt, it was not isolationism. It was the affirmation that there is a fundamental difference between trusting in a human power that can fail and trusting in a reality that does not fail. This pattern of thought runs through the entire book. And in chapter 53, something happens that even the most skeptical readers recognize as extraordinary. Isaiah describes a suffering servant with a specificity that exceeds any historical figure of his own time. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. The text continues with images that any Christian reader recognizes immediately as describing the crucifixion. 700 years before this method of execution was even invented by the Romans. Crucifixion as a systematic form of execution was introduced by the Persians and later adopted and widely used by the Romans. In Isaiah's time, it did not exist as a practice, and yet the description in chapter 53 includes details of physical suffering, social rejection, vicarious death, and the justification of others that correspond to the account of Jesus, death with a precision that turned this chapter into one of the most debated in the history of biblical exegesis. It worked again. So where does that leave you, the person reading this in 2026? The Middle East is in flames. Nations that Isaiah named are at war. Israel exists and continues to exist, despite everything that should have, statistically, eliminated it. The pattern of pressure, resistance, and survival that the text describes is underway, and at the same time, the world continues. History continues. People wake up in the morning, make coffee, take their children to school, work, love, suffer, and live without the end times interrupting the routine. Which of these realities is the most real? The honest answer is both. The tension between the daily life that continues and the possibility that something greater is underway is not new. It existed in Isaiah's time. The inhabitants of Jerusalem also had routines, also had plans, also thought that tomorrow would essentially be a continuation of yesterday. And a barefoot man walked among them, announcing that the world they knew was about to change irreversibly. Some listened. Most did not. Isaiah did not write to satisfy the curiosity of future generations. He wrote because there was something happening that surpassed politics, alliances, and armies. There was a plan in progress that no emperor knew and no treaty could cancel. What we see today in the Middle East, the wars, the collapses, the improbable resistance of Israel, may or may not be the literal fulfillment of those words. But one thing is hard to deny. The scenario he described exists. The nations he named exist, and the tensions he pointed out have shown no sign of truce. As for the rapture, the end times, the moment when all this converges to a final point, that is a question that theologians, scholars, and believers have debated with depth and honesty for centuries. What Isaiah made clear is that there is a God who acts within history, who uses the chaos of the world as a stage, and that, at the center of it all, there is a permanent invitation to be on the right side when history reaches its final chapter. The man who walked barefoot for 3 years did not ask you to agree with him. He asked you to pay attention. In 2026, the noise of the world has never been louder. Missiles, notifications, headlines, analyses, opinions, everything screaming at the same time, competing for every second of your attention. Paying attention to what truly matters has never been so difficult, nor so necessary. The question is not just about 2026, the question is about you.